As we all know, there is no sure-shot recipe for success, but there are some key ingredients: hard working, perseverance, resilience, drive, and in the strength to go on in the face of criticism. Our chief guest today is the embodiment of all these virtues. Ladies and gentlemen, I am proud to welcome Dr. Raghuram Rajan. Sir, the entire eyes are on you and your words. We look upon you to lead kindly life into the very minds of the subject and also for the inspire and include yourself. Thank you.
Shri Somaiya, Ilaben, Shri Bhushan Diwan, Shri Ranganathan, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, and dear students, and of course my friends from the press. It gives me great pleasure to come here to Somaiya Vidyavihar. Let me at the outset say to friends in the press who are waiting for me to say something interesting that I really see this as an interaction with students and faculty, and it's not a place where I want to say anything about inflation, interest rates, and all the other things that you're interested in. It's great to be back at a university to see the wonderful innovations that are being done in this institute. It was just amazing to see what the students are capable of. And it tells us once again that the role of a university is not really to teach you what to think. Teaching you what to think lasts a few months after you leave. But it is to teach students how to think. And sometimes not even how to think, but just the willingness to ask questions, and better still ask the right question. Question everything is something great philosophers have said. And I think if you go out of a university with curiosity, that sustains you for life and keeps you continuously learning and making a contribution to society. So I'm very glad that from what I've seen, students are full of that kind of ambition, and I wish you very well in all the endeavors that you're undertaking, ranging from technology, the chess playing machine that I saw for the blind, or the car that seems to be able to climb down stairs. I didn't risk coming down with that car, but I understand it works well. To medical interventions, to of course to learning about languages. We saw an invocation in Sanskrit, an attempt to keep alive India's ancient languages. This is tremendous work, and more power to all that you're trying to do both here and elsewhere. Now, while I was thinking about what I'd talk about, it seemed to me that something that, since I just gave a lecture yesterday at the IBA FICCI conference on the Indian economy, I thought what I'd spend some time today on is what's happening outside in the global economy. And the point of what I want to say is really that economic policies are rarely what the textbooks say. And I'm sure we have some students of economics here, and the textbooks are all very clear about what one should do in different situations. But really the world, for one, is more complicated in terms of analyzing what is going on. But even if solutions are clear, it's not clear that there is often political will to do what is necessary to undertake those solutions. And sometimes we end up doing what is easy and what is convenient rather than what is necessary and what is hard. And that's why the field of economics used to be known as political economy. And I think it's high time we went back to call it political economy. So let me talk about what I think is going on. What we've had in the West is a very, very slow recovery from the crisis. Now, this is surprising because typically the faster you fall, the faster you recover in terms of growth. And if it's one part of the wheel going down, it should be the other part of the wheel going up. But what we've had is a sharp fall in growth and then a very, very gentle recovery. In fact, some European economies are still not back to where they were before the crisis, and others have just made it there. So what's going on? And this is where immediately you have 4 or 5 different explanations. And the standard explanation stems from an explanation which emerged during the Great Depression, which was the Keynesian view, that what's happened is demand has collapsed and we have to revive demand. And because the private sector is too shell-shocked, industrialists don't want to invest, people don't want to buy because they don't have jobs, we have to prime the pump. We have to start activity going. How do we start activity going? We start by the government spending. So let's do large budget deficits, get spending up. Once we get spending up, things will start picking up, and we'll be back to growth. Well, a number of countries ran large budget deficits, whether they wanted to or not, they had to, and it didn't make so much of a difference in terms of growth. Now, the Keynesian response is, you didn't do enough, you have to do more. Of course, many countries have spent a lot. In Japan, which has been in a virtual crisis from 1990, today owes 2.5 times its GDP. That's its national debt, because it has been spending again and again and again, but still not got the economy into sustained growth. So is it just government spending? There's another facet to that some people argue. Well, it's not just government spending, it's that there are a lot of highly leveraged individuals, highly leveraged corporations, there are even governments that have a lot of debt. And the real problem is too much debt. This is what Irving Fisher, another great economist during the Depression, called the debt deflation problem. That is, if you have a lot of debt, it's very hard for you to go out and spend because you borrowed too much. You don't spend, prices fall, and the real value of your debt, remember your debt is denominated in dollars or rupees. If prices start falling, effectively you have to pay more in terms of actual value when you repay, so your debt burden goes up. So this is what Irving Fisher called the debt deflation theory, and he argued this was responsible for a lot of the slow growth during the Depression. And this is what a number of economists today say, well, this may be the problem. What we have to do is try and reflate the economy through monetary mechanisms. Let us pump money into the economy. And so a number of central banks across the world have run extremely accommodative monetary policies. Interest rates are close to zero, but they haven't stopped at that. They've actually printed money to buy a variety of assets. This is called quantitative easing. And the idea is the more we spend, the more we can get prices to start moving up. We can get some inflation. Inflation will push down the value of debt, but even without that, it can push up the economy. Problem, of course, is even this. Maybe we have avoided a great deflation. We will never know, but we certainly haven't got a lot of inflation in industrial countries. The euro area's inflation is about 0.5%. In the US, it's 1.5 to 2%. We haven't got high inflation, and growth is still very tepid. So the traditional solutions of stimulus don't seem to be working, but of course the diehards will say you haven't done enough. And of course there's no answer to that. Whatever you do, you haven't done enough until it works. That's not necessarily scientific, because that's something you can say of anything. The alternative view of what's going on in the West is that the real problem was the underlying difficulties in growth were there even before the Great Recession. That there were problems in growth. Growth was too slow, and that was masked by a binge of borrowing. Whether it was borrowing by the governments in a number of countries in order to expand activity, or whether it was borrowing by corporations in a bunch of other countries, or whether it was borrowing by individuals to build houses, to buy houses, and so on in a third set of countries. So debt fueled an additional amount of demand in these countries, especially because globally savings were high and there was a relatively low interest rate, allowed countries to borrow until they could borrow no more. And countries like Greece and Spain found there were ultimate constraints in borrowing. So the underlying problem was masked by debt, and then that leads to the question, what was the underlying problem? So there are 2 or 3 explanations as to what the underlying problem was. One is simply that these are advanced countries, and advanced countries have to keep innovating. They're at the frontiers, they have to keep innovating. Fortunately for less advanced countries like us, we can catch up, we can see what they're doing, we can build roads, highways, this, that, we can spend a long time catching up, so we can get growth relatively easily. But for them to grow, because most people are already employed, they already use up a lot of capital, they really have to do things more cleverly. They have to do innovation. And there the argument is that the big innovations happened in the early part of the century, of the 20th century, and were rolled out through much of the 20th century. But more recently, we haven't had huge innovations. And for people who have grown up on the internet, on Twitter, on Facebook, and so on, you may say, what? These aren't innovations? I mean, we've had tremendous innovation in the last few years. I mean, think of GPS, think of Twitter, think of the internet. That's right. But if you think of the early part of the 20th century, think of the innovations that happened then. We went from the horse-driven buggy to the motor car. We went from a ship that sailed to a steamship. We went from ironing with, which still happens in India, big heavy irons with coal, to electric irons. We went from washing by hand to washing using a washing machine. We went from gas and petroleum to fuel our lights to electric lights. There were tremendous innovations. We went to the airplane. The airplane is a 20th century innovation. The point is that there were significant innovations in the 20th century, and that led to a substantial increase in incomes, in productivity. Think of the life of a housewife in the rural United States, who went from having to spend half the day washing clothes, trying to fill the furnace, this, that, to being able to do everything by just switching on a switch, because everything was electrified. Electricity brought so many big changes to their lives. So productivity increased tremendously, and that pace of productivity growth, as electricity went through these countries, as the motor car reached everywhere, as the telephone reached everywhere, the pace of productivity growth slowed. Yes, the mobile phone was an innovation, but you could do pretty much 90% of what you could do with a landline. The mobile phone helped you call somebody while you were on, walking down the street, but what addition in productivity did it do? So one set of people argue that really the problem is we haven't had big contributions to productivity. Another bunch of people, and economics is full of controversy, say, no, that's not true. The internet has made major changes in productivity. We just don't measure it properly. So for example, your son or one of you young 15 and 20-year-olds may spend the whole day on an app sort of playing games. And that's fun. But you don't watch TV. You don't go to the cinema to pay for a movie ticket. If you went to the cinema to pay for a movie ticket, you would pay for it. That would show up as growth. That would count as value added in the economy as a contribution to productivity, right? But the fact that you're playing a game on your Twitter, on your little screen, and not paying for it because you downloaded the app free, you're still having the same kind of enjoyment, but you're not paying for it, doesn't show up as GDP, doesn't show up as growth, not counted as productivity. So another bunch of people say the real problem is you're not measuring the value added by the new economy properly. Productivity is high, but it's not being paid for, and over time, as we find ways to pay for this, it will show up as growth. So there's this debate. The net effect, however, is productivity growth has slowed down in industrial countries considerably, and what that means is without that kind of growth, at least growth that people pay for, you don't get the same kind of level of jobs, and that's why pre-financial crisis, to keep the growth up, countries pumped the economies with a lot of debt and growth. But it couldn't last because growth which is fueled by debt, by borrowing, ultimately you run out of money to pay the debt, and you have the Great Recession. So the point of these kinds of people, Robert Gordon, for example, at Northwestern, is look, we need to find new ways of productivity. And of course, the critics say, no, it's not that we have to find new ways of productivity. We have to find new ways of monetizing the productivity we are already creating, so that more people can get jobs. Anyway, that debate is going on. Second explanation for the slowdown is demographic change. That the West is growing older. Japan has already started growing old. And somehow we are not able to fully conceptualize what the effects of an aging society does. As people get older, consumption patterns change, investment patterns change. Corporations in Japan may not be investing as much as they used to when the population was much younger. When the population was younger, there's a greater sense that demand would be strong. Today, with the population aging, maybe we go and produce in countries which are younger, where there is a greater labor force to employ and where there's greater demand likely. So it may be that what we have failed to fully understand are the effects of population aging. For example, one of the constant refrains about Japan over these last 20 years has been the very slow pace of overall GDP growth. But if you look at the fact that Japan's labor force has also been shrinking over this period, as people get older and leave the labor force, Japan should be producing less. And in fact, when you adjust for the fact that the labor force is shrinking, Japan is not doing badly at all. But there is a sense of malaise about the once vibrant country, that somehow it's not holding up. It's not standing up to its place in the global economy, and some of that may have to do with population aging. And the question is, do we fully understand all the effects of population aging? And some of them may be showing up in the slow growth of industrial countries. The third explanation is inequality. And some of you may have read Thomas Piketty's very popular and important text on capital, but it's just another sort of version of a debate that's been going on for quite some time, which is that inequality has been rising in industrial countries. And one way to think about it is think about the jobs that used to be there in a typical industrial country. And I want you to conceptualize a 2x2 matrix. Think of on the vertical, on the x-axis, if you will, we have jobs that are routine and jobs that are not routine. Okay? And on the y-axis, we divide it into jobs that are skilled and jobs that are not skilled. Now, typically, there were jobs in each one of these boxes. Think of a routine but skilled job, the job of a clerk. You have to have some skills, knowing which side of the balance sheet you put down the numbers to make the books match, etc. But it's fairly routine. Basically, this can be a debit or a credit. The people who work in insurance companies adjusting claims. Lots of these jobs used to be there, earning middle class salaries. Then there used to be the skilled non-routine. We all know what that is, a doctor, a consultant. The job requires lots of skills, but it's not routine. Every new case is different. And then you have the routine, unskilled jobs. Think of a factory worker putting bottle caps, one bottle cap after the other. It's the same routine job, doesn't require tremendous skills. And then you have the unskilled but non-routine. Think of a gardener. It's not a very skilled job. There are very skilled gardeners. I don't want to disrespect them, but there are routine gardener jobs, but it is you can't replace the gardener by a machine because every garden is different, and trying to do grow the right flowers, etc., is a non-routine job. What's been happening in the United States and in other countries of the West is that whatever is routine, whether it be skilled or unskilled, is disappearing. Okay? Think of routine skilled jobs, a clerk replaced by a computer, or a clerk replaced by somebody sitting in Mumbai or Bangalore. Okay? Your medical records are transcribed in Hyderabad. They're not transcribed in Dayton, Ohio. Similarly, think about the routine unskilled jobs. The factory worker, that's either been automated, now machine does the screwing on the bottle tops, or it's been sent to Vietnam and to the Philippines. So everything that's routine is gone, which leaves the non-routine skill, which is tremendously high paying. I mean, think of what a doctor gets or a consultant gets, and the non-routine unskilled, which is tremendously low paying, the burger flipper at McDonald's, or the gardener who mows your lawn. And that, to some extent, creates jobs at the extremes, the top and the bottom, but the middle is getting hollowed out. And so, one of the arguments is rising inequality in the West is because the nature of jobs is being affected by globalization and technology, more by technology than globalization, and the middle jobs are disappearing, and therefore in a sense, consumption is also falling, because the guys who used to consume, the middle class, is shrinking. The rich make a ton of money, but how much can you spend? Yes, you can buy a few more yachts, but beyond that, it becomes problematic. You, after all, have to eat the same food. You can't eat 3 meals when you're rich, otherwise you die an early death. So the point is, the rich don't consume beyond a point. The very poor don't have the ability to consume, and the middle class is disappearing, therefore consumption has fallen. So, there are at least three different versions of what's going on, and many other explanations which I won't go into. The problem, of course, is each one of these, if they are the real problem, is extremely difficult to solve. How do you get a society to have better ideas? How do you get a society to implement those ideas in a better way? Yes, you create a vibrant society. The United States is as vibrant as one can get, but still it's not, doing as much as is needed. How do you deal with the problem of aging? How do you create the institutions to manage that? Certainly people are working longer, people are staying in the labor force longer, and you sort of have to alter institutions to enable that to happen. But still, it's extremely difficult to deal with all the consequences. And with the problem of routine jobs going away, well, you want to push everybody from the unskilled non-routine to the skilled non-routine kind of job. But that requires education. And education of the kind that you're getting here is difficult for the following reason. Not so much that we can't create educational institutions. Of course, creating a good educational institution is extremely hard. But more difficult is the deprived. By the time they come to the educational institutions, have a very great difficulty in coping with education. In the West, the child who comes from a ghetto and has not had the ability to go to a good school, has not had adequate nutrition, has not had even parents who tell them how to to read and push them to read and learn at an early age, they fall further and further behind. And therefore, regardless of how good quality schools you may create, and there is a lot to be desired there, just the family background, the community background itself makes it very hard for them to compete. So what you really need is a solution which goes not just across educational institutions, but across communities, revitalizes communities and gets them to focus on the need for skill building, but that's much harder. Bottom line, I think, and I don't want to go on too long, is that the underlying problems are really very difficult to fix. They used to be the problems, and this is what I keep saying in the West when I speak. They used to be problems that emerging markets have. The problems of how to generate growth, the problems of how to educate your population, the problems of how to create the right institutions to deal with change. They are problems we have as an economy today, India has. But they are problems the West thought it was done with. It had created decent institutions. It had created good educational institutions. They weren't problems they had to deal with once again. And now they have to confront them once again, and it takes many years to deal with them. Most societies don't have patience to wait for those many years. I don't want growth 5 years from now, 10 years from now. I want growth today. And so what happens is, when you want growth today and you can't borrow anymore because debt is already too high, it goes back to the central bank, which then pumps up money supply and runs very accommodative policies. So the pressure in the West has fallen on the central banks. Monetary stimulus seems to be the answer of the day. My fear, unfortunately, is it's not a lasting answer, that the underlying activity needs to be done. You know, countries like Japan understand this. When Prime Minister Abe says there are 3 pillars, 3 arrows we want to base our recovery on. The first arrow is fiscal stimulus, second arrow is monetary stimulus, but the third arrow, very important, is structural change. Problem, of course, is easier doing the first 2, much harder doing the third. And I think the world economy is still hoping and waiting to see that third rolled out in full measure. And it's being rolled out, but we have to see how it happens. But this is true of every other country in the industrial West. They need to undertake structural reforms also, and they can't rely only on stimulus. Unfortunately, stimulus is easier, and the consequences of that kind of stimulus come into our countries. Last point, of course, with these easy monetary policies across the world, we've had a lot of money coming into our economies. India has benefited from having a lot of money flow in because of the easy policies there. And we have to be careful about this money, because if we say this is wonderful, they all like us, we're following tremendous policies, that's why we've got this money, and we go out and spend it, we run large current account deficits based on this foreign borrowing, but this foreign borrowing cannot be taken for granted. At some point, these investors will find better uses of their money back home, want to go out once again, and that's when you have financial difficulty as the money flows out. So we have to be very careful about spending, because financial conditions will change. This is why numbers like current account deficit yesterday are worth watching closely. We've managed to bring down the current account deficit substantially. We are limiting our reliance on foreign debt, and it's important we keep it this way. We manage the economy in a way that is careful, that is circumspect, because that is the only way that we ourselves can continue doing what we need to do, and hope and pray that the industrial West will do what they need to do. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.